committee meeting for Monday, February 12th. We're ready to begin. We have a quorum. I'm Paul Krikorian. I'm joined by my colleagues, Mr. Kretz and Mr. Bonin, and we're ready to begin. Mr. Williams, are there any general public comment cards?
No, sir, I don't
General
believe...
public comment is closed. Are there any multiple item comment cards?
No, sir.
Any other cards on any of the items?
No, sir.
Public comment on all items is closed. And members, I'd recommend items 6 and 7 for consent approval unless there are questions or concerns. So it will be the action of the committee to approve the item number 6 as amended. There will be a technical correction, which will be distributed momentarily or read. Can we read that? Okay, so we're going to read that into the record on item number 6. Who has, you have the technical correction?
No, not yet.
Who has the technical correction on this?
Okay, for item number 6, this is regarding motion Rodriguez-Rue relative to the transfer of funding for continued geographic information system software maintenance and support from vendor Esri Inc. for fiscal year 2017-18. We have a technical correction. The Department of Sanitation indicates that the entire amount of $171,777 should be from Fund 100, Department 82, account 003040 for fiscal year 2017-18.
All right, if there's no objection to the technical correction, item 6 is approved as amended, and item 7 also is approved. And that will bring us to our closed session. So we'll begin closed session with item number 1. Okay, we are back in open session, and members, I was going to take up items 6 and 7 again so that we can take a full vote, but we'll wait until Mr. Kretz comes back on that. So we'll go ahead and take up item number 5.
Item number 5 is continued from February 5th, 2018. It's Office of Finance reports relative to an analysis of the impact of extending the city's business tax renewal deadline from February 28th to April 15th to align with the California Franchise Tax Board and Federal Internal Revenue Service tax deadlines.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And I apologize, members. I know some of you heard this when I was out, so I'm not sure exactly where we left off on the reporting part of this, but I'll leave that to you to...
So the last, Melissa Krantz, Office of the CAO, for the last committee meeting, there were some questions from committee members, and then Office of Finance has provided its report back to address those questions. Those questions included how many taxpayers would benefit from a delayed tax date, what city due dates are for other cities, and what was the other one?
The outreach.
The outreach efforts of the Office of Finance.
Okay. So you want to give us a quick overview
Sure.
of that?
Basically, in our report back on the first item was, and this is Carl Sampson with the Office of Finance, is identifying business tax filings by date for the calendar. So what we did is we broke out the last 2 past tax periods for 2017 and 2016. And identified, of the renewals that are a response, how many were timely. So there's about 300,000 renewals for each of the years are timely prior to March 1st. Between March 1st and April 25th. And this represents the period of time where they first become delinquent, right before we send out what we call a notice of hearing, which is the second renewal. And so that's that has been around 25,000 renewals that happened in that period. And then we'll send out the second renewal, which we, again, is titled Notice of Hearing, and that goes out to everyone that hasn't responded to us yet. We notify them that, that there's a need to renew, and we give them basically a 10-day window to respond. And so that's been running the last week of April and the first week of May these past couple of years. And so between 29,000 firms respond as a result of that. And then the last figure, which is representing after that dies down, is really the renewals that happen subsequently. So these are people that, finally will renew after a period of time. Most of them, however, are people that we later discover that have been in business, so we have to retroactively renew them. And so those are the ones that fall into that category.
So to speak a little bit more about these two tables, the taxpayers that would benefit from the April 15th date would only be those ones in the between March and April 25th date. So right now it's about 25,000 for both of those past two tax periods. If you took about 5,000 off, representing people remitting after April 15th, that'd probably be about 5% of taxpayers in that category remitting after our current tax deadline, but before April 15th. So those would be the people who would benefit from an April 15th deadline. Everybody else after that would still be late regardless, if they follow this pattern of remittance.
Well, and if this is just a function of human behavior to pay it right at or a little bit after the delinquency date, if the delinquency date moves, presumably that human behavior moves with it.
Correct. So we did discuss that in the last meeting, which was why the assumption was that the behavior didn't change too much, which is why the initial movement of a tax date to a later date would probably be about a $22 million hit, with assuming people didn't change their behavior. The other thing we wanted to point out is with regards to the idea that you're synchronizing the business tax with the income tax, it should be noted that corporate filers actually do have an earlier income tax date for federal filing. That would be March 15th. If they're filing April 15th, they're even late for federal income taxes as well. So that's another issue to consider, is whether April 15th is really something that would actually help them out. To calculate gross receipts is a fairly simple math problem. That's something that most of the taxpayers are able to do at the end of December 31st. Income tax, which is filed federally, is a more complicated calculation, where you do the deductions and everything. So it's probably a lot of this late filing is just behavior.
Okay. I don't know if you guys have all kind of exhausted thinking about this, or if you have questions, but I'm happy to turn it over to anybody who, because Mr. Blumenfield.
Well, have we gotten LA Chamber, VICA, BizFed, or other groups? Have they put a advocated position on this, or have they come to us on this?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Okay, and then another thing, we talked about this a little bit, but we also discussed the desirability of syncing the con plan or CDBG year to the fiscal year, and which would also have a one-time hit to the general fund. And I just wanted to try to balance the two, and what is more important for us and why.
Well, thank you, because just to further the scope of that, can you walk us through how it is that there is a one-time shortfall? Because I was not 100% clear on how that works either. So
a hit or a delay?
And I'm assuming it's the same, and I think it's the same logic for the con plan in terms of the delay. It's like what we did at the state when we needed to save money. We paid people on July 1st instead of June 30th.
But then you'd have an increase in revenues in the following, or
except
reduction
that
in
it
expenses
goes
in
on
the
forever.
following fiscal year.
It goes on forever.
That's
So
right.
you actually, in that case, you save money forever.
Right.
And this case, we lose money forever.
But that's what, yeah, that's the
Except
part
we're
that
not,
I'm.
we're not really losing money, it's an accounting mechanism for the year.
Well,
I'll let you guys explain.
Sure.
I think the
Ben
CAO
Spahal
feels
with the
different.
CAO. I came up to answer your question related to the comp plan, which is a different matter altogether. As you know, as you probably have heard that years back, the city decided to change the program year for the comp plan to, in essence, advance it so that we would receive a one-time infuse of, because we'd have the money sooner so that we could start spending those dollars sooner from the federal government for those services that the comp plan supports. So in other words, if it goes from March to April, I believe, and if we wanted to sync that budget with the city's fiscal year, it would be a time between April to June where there wouldn't be any funding from the federal government for those programs, and so there would be a gap of dollars and potential services. But again, that's a separate issue from this, one that's, I think, worth considering, but it's separate and apart from this discussion here on the business tax.
Okay, so on this, walk us through the $22 million hit to the budget. Why is this a $22 million hit?
So basically, the large majority of our collections are as a result of our collections up through March 1st, okay? And then what we need to do before we send out the notice of hearing is to process all of those collections that come in timely. And you have a lot of them that are still in the mail and whatnot, and so we don't receive those physically by probably the middle of the following week, so you're like March 7th, March 8th. And then it takes an effort on our part to get them all into the system properly loaded by the end of the month for us to generate the file. So it takes about a month after March 1st for us to have the file ready in order to send out notice of hearing. Okay. So if we extend that date to April 15th, then it'll be mid-May for us to be able to know who we should send out the notice of hearing mailing to. And it's that notice of hearing that's roughly $20 million of income that's coming in. So that gets delayed now from the end of April for another month and a half, so that's the end of May. Mid-June is when that will need to start, and then we would need to process all that money between that time and the start of the new fiscal year. The other thing that we do too after we conclude the notice of hearing is at that point then we really know who hasn't reported yet, and so we'll engage in field sweeps where we'll look at, okay, who renewed and paid last year that are at the high end of the spectrum, and we'll follow up with them and get collections in that manner as well. So that activity between the notice of hearing and those sweeps would then get pushed into the next fiscal year. And so the money will still be there, it's just happening after July 1st.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Did you want to add?
No, I mean, and then, of course, that activity is always delayed because of the later due date, so.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Raymond.
So you're suggesting that because of the April on the state filing, that's what would cause this. However, because the federal tax returns on corporate are due in March, that wouldn't have the same impact if we're March instead of January.
So what I was trying to make there is that there's a lot of late remittances that might not necessarily be tied to the fact that people are trying to finalize their federal tax returns for their business tax filings. The corporate business tax is due March 15th. And so, you see a lot of late remittances well beyond March 15th that it's just taxpayer behavior. And so you can also get to that 22 million with the idea that you give people more time, they'll take more time to delay as well.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that's with everything in life.
Right, right.
But the question is, what is the difference between on that 22 million, how many of those are filing late after the January deadline because of behavior and versus trying to tie it to when they're doing their corporate returns in March?
So, this is not going to make any assumption about people filing extensions, but if you look at the two tables, you'll see that the 26,000 and the 39,000, these are people filing well after April 15th. And so.
How many of those are new businesses versus existing?
These are renewals?
And you're looking at the after May 15 date?
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say that the majority of those that are after the May 15 date are probably going to be newly discovered businesses instead of
Those
just
are-
trailing renewals,
Okay.
yeah.
And those newly discovered businesses, so there's a
Yeah.
little bit of a.
And that
you
goes
have to
on for a
actually
couple of years.
Drill down, and then also figure out on how many, those are numbers of renewals, how many fall under the $100,000 category when there's no liability on the sheer numbers.
If you were to make a generalization.
Well, no, not a generalization, actual numbers, like how many of
Yeah.
those fall under the $100,000 exemption,
It is probably the majority of
the
them.
majority. So what I think that highlights clearly is that it probably makes more sense to go with March. January doesn't. I've talked, in answering your question, spoken to many of the chambers who are very much in favor of it. But, and then that would eliminate the cash flow, for the most part, most of it, issue. It's not a loss in money, but and would still recover most of that in the same calendar year and put us in compliance with when they're doing the returns for their corporate returns for federal versus doing a separate set of books right after the holidays and having their tax liability in January, knowing full well the statement that was just made that the majority of the ones that are putting off are new filers, and most of those are in fact new businesses or found businesses. So we're still going to always have that issue no matter what. So while that hasn't been studied, I don't know that we need a lot of study on it, but I'm happy to entertain any concept or idea. But I think in light of the discussion, the reports, and I appreciate staff really doing a deeper dive into this and looking at what other cities are doing as well, it makes sense to move it to, rather than April, to March, to around the same time as the federal returns are due for corporations.
Mr. Kretz?
I was just going to ask if we asked the LA Chamber to do any analysis of this and to opine on what an appropriate date would be.
I was thinking
Have they done
similar.
that? Have
Not
we
to my
asked?
knowledge, no.
Would seem like that would be kind of a missing piece to this. I mean, as 5 elected officials that are not business people and not as focused on this issue and this kind of analysis, I think we can come to our own conclusions, but I think it would be helpful if we had their opinion as well.
I think the CEO can work with the Office of Finance to reach out to the chamber and at least ask the question.
Mr. Bonner?
I'm inclined to agree with Mr. Englander on this, but if you're going to be asking the opinion of an outside business entity, it's not the LA Area Chamber. You need to talk to the smaller chambers. You need to talk to the West LA Chamber. You need to talk to the San Pedro Chamber. Because I actually think this impact, the different timelines, is more significant for smaller businesses than it is for the bigger businesses that have larger accounting staffs. And the bigger companies that the LA Area Chamber represents, not that they don't represent small ones as well, aren't going to be as impacted by this as the mom and pops are that we represent in our districts.
I would suggest we, if I could, move forward on looking at it for a March deadline. I think it alleviates a lot of the issues and the problems that you've outlined, and it's just much more business friendly. But however the chair wants to pursue that.
Well, let me tell you a couple of my thoughts. The one was the one-time cost, but if we could contain most of that within the same fiscal year, that impact is reduced, certainly. And it sounds like, especially with a month earlier, the chances of a significant portion of that slopping over into the next fiscal year is probably relatively small. So that's less of a concern. My much bigger concern is the accuracy of our revenue projections during the middle of budget preparations. And, right now, with an earlier deadline, we have a pretty good handle on what most of our GRT revenues are going to be. And a delay of a few months significantly affects the margin of error that we're going to have in trying to predict what those revenues are going to be.
That is definitely the case. As you know, our office helps the mayor's budget team put together their proposed budget that's due April 20th. All those decisions that feed into the April 20th budget have to be made, as early as like the last week of March, in order for us to be able to balance everything out, reconcile their decisions with the actual numbers that are coming in. The business tax is the actual last piece of revenue information that we get, because we're looking at the daily submissions every day. Like how much did we get today? How much did we get today? Because what we get in the current fiscal year will feed the projection for next fiscal year. And to the extent that we don't know what's come in, it's harder for us and to provide the mayor's team a revenue projection for the following fiscal year, which then impacts what decisions they have to make as part of that budget. So, for us, it's one of those cases where the data is very key, and the earlier we have that, the better decisions we could help.
Well, and it also affects us, because after the mayor proposes the budget, we usually have some adjustments that you come to us with. Sometimes it's a little more GRT revenues. Sometimes it might be disappointing news. And then the more time that we have to consider how to spend that money or what we need to cut is better. Better if we have more. Now, moving it back a month to March, somewhat alleviates that concern. It doesn't eliminate it, but it makes it a little less. But on the other side of this equation, and I think to Mr. Bonnett's point about the smaller businesses, where I'm especially concerned about this and where I think the change would have the most benefit is actually for those businesses that don't owe any taxes at all. Because the real mom and pop business who may be under the threshold, the 2/3 of our businesses that don't pay any GRT at all, they still have to file. And they get hit with that penalty if they don't file on time. And many of them may not even be aware of this until they get their penalty bill. And so for them, I'd be all for, if they don't owe tax, I'd be all for pushing it back, well later, just so that they avoid that penalty. But if they owe the money, it's kind of like when you don't pay when you get an extension on your federal income tax, you still have to pay the tax, but you get the extension on filing the return. It's a similar kind of metaphor. If you owe tax under our GRT, I want to get your money as soon as possible. But if you don't, and you're going to get penalized for not filing a return, I'd rather postpone that penalty date as long as possible. See what I mean? So I kind of go in two directions on this, depending on whether it's a small business or a larger business. And other than the sort of logic of, lining up deadlines, I'm not really seeing where there's a lot of business advantage in moving this up. Businesses know what their revenues are. They know that on a weekly basis. They don't really need to. I don't see what the extension, how that's beneficial to a business. And I know you've talked to some chambers, but I can't think of anybody who's raised this issue ever with me, a business or a chamber or.
So,
why
yeah,
it's
no, I
important.
appreciate that. A couple things. Falling back on, and I'm not going to fall on the sword on this, but I will tell you, having been an owner of several businesses, having been partners in many years in the city of LA with several businesses, I can tell you firsthand that this is a major issue. Having talked to dozens of businesses and folks about this is a major gripe. And while they have many others, and most of them want to discuss all the other major issues that they're faced with every single day, ask anybody right now, if you stop a business on the street, what's your biggest complaint with the city of LA? It's not this. It may be their trash fees or the lack of picking them up. This is just yet another issue of business tax when it comes up in conversation, that particularly since of when it's due, like right after the holidays. And they don't always know at a moment's notice, and it does take, and they want to double check for accuracy of working with their CPAs to submit. It's not just about going onto their QuickBooks and printing out a P&L and going online and filing it. It's a little more complicated for many of these businesses. In terms of knowing the revenue at budget time, there aren't huge fluctuations year to year, huge fluctuations that would make a dramatic difference in not being able to put a city budget together. In fact, I would argue that budget after budget, year after year, various mayors, including all of them, have come up with projections in revenue for policies we've never even passed. There is so much what I would call room to adopt a policy like this based on assumptions from historical information and projections that we do for almost all other revenue streams, including TOT, I mean, there's so many, that this wouldn't be a significant difference. And that's why I looked at splitting the difference and looking at March, because it is significant, and it is taking a step to be a little more business-friendly, and there's no doubt in my mind that we can't figure out with projections and historical data what we're really looking at in terms of this category. Not to mention, we don't spend all the money up front. We've got the TRAN and a lot of the borrowing throughout the year for cash flow. We also have FSRs and updates. We also put a lot of money into the UB for various programs and projects that many don't materialize throughout the year. I mean, this isn't going to be, while a panacea for businesses of turning a corner dramatically, it's helpful. Am I going to fall on the sword? No. You guys want to vote no? Fine. But I think at this point, without having further study, without having even further study on it or going back and doing surveys of businesses, there's too many other important things to work on. I think this is the right thing to do, particularly for small and local businesses, period. And short of that, I'm ready to vote on it, and if it doesn't pass, then I think we need to move on. We've spent a lot of time on this already, but I think it's the right thing to do.
Mr. Bloomfield.
Okay. One thing, I sort of agree on the projection thing. I don't think we make projections anyway on our budgeting, so I don't think that's going to make or break us because it's all based on projection, but we'd have a little bit more information. But if we moved it to March, what would be it's 22 million one-time hit if it's in April. What is the dollar figure if it's in March?
Well, we'd have to look at that to give you a precise figure, but probably the majority of that 22 million would fall within this fiscal year.
So no.
It would be minimal.
When you say, well, those are three different answers.
Yeah.
No hit is zero. Majority of 22 million
Majority.
is 11 million and $1. Minimal is 5. So what is it?
I'm going to go for 11.
Maybe I'm too literal, but I'd like to.
Minimal can be sliced a few different ways.
Yeah. So I mean, what are we?
I mean, we'd have to crunch it to give it an exact figure. My gut feeling would be at least 2/3 of it would be within this current fiscal year.
Because that makes me a lot more comfortable if we're talking about a couple of $1 million in order to do something nice for business versus $11 million, which starts to sound like more programmatic. Either way, when you start comparing it to number of police officers, it sounds significant, but anyway, I'd love to know the actual number, because even though it's
My son would.
an accounting thing, it is money that we're going to have to put into this year's budget.
Okay.
But I'm assuming that's something you guys could figure out.
Yes.
Mr. Bonnet?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo Mr. Englander's perspective on this. I've actually heard about this from a few folks. Definitely not a front burner issue, not a huge thing. I never cared about it enough to bring an emotion on it, for instance. The context in which I heard about it is in my district, where there've been this competition between Santa Monica and Los Angeles for business, and businesses were being wooed into the city, particularly when I first took office. They were wooed in part by the promise of the 3-year business tax holiday, and then because they were unaware of this weirdness in our timeline with February, they got penalized for not meeting the February deadline, and as a result, they were never allowed to avail themselves of the business tax holiday. and it was sort of a big ding for them, so that's the context in which I heard about this. It seems a little smoother and cleaner to tie it with the March, but again, it's not the hugest issue.
Yeah. Okay. It doesn't sound like any of us has really a lot of fire in the belly about this, but I think March 15th. I think March 15th makes more sense than April 15th. I do think that for those owing no tax, I would prefer that they have no penalty prior to April 15th, because I think those will be the individual filers for the most part. Those will be people who are thinking about taxes when they do their property tax and then their income tax. So for them, I would certainly, I'd like to move that we extend the date for delinquency to April 15th for those folks who owe no tax. But on the March 15th deadline, I could kind of go either way. What's your preference, members, to?
My preference would be for you to vote yes on the March 15th.
No, I'm one vote. What does everybody else have to say? Mr. Kretz?
I think both your ideas are good. I'm good with the March 15th and the April 15th for filers that have no tax liability.
I mean, I'm comfortable with it. I'd like to get actual numbers on what it costs us. I mean, I understand it doesn't cost us anything, but it is money that we have to put into a budget this year because of the accounting issue. So I'd like to know what the number is. 2/3 of 22 million sounds a lot better. And I'd like, and I'm willing to move forward with it, but I'd like to see also some formal, I appreciate you've heard about it. No one's ever approached me about it, although it's very logical that it's an issue. I'd like to give a chance to get some formal feedback, also for our benefit, so that when we're doing this, we can be sort of getting the due credit for it in the sense that folks will speak out and say this is a real problem. So
Okay.
getting some chambers and other folks to weigh in to.
So just so we're clear, because you said, in the budget, I want to make sure that our timing, that we're all in agreement on timing. I mean, we're talking about March of 2019. So
Whatever year.
yeah, I know, but we can plan for it a little bit more in advance and than doing it this year. I just want to make sure I understood that correctly, because when you said that, I thought no one's talking about doing it this year. Okay.
And it's not possible. As I said, they're talking about a $5 million hit instead of a $22 million hit, which seems a little more reasonable, easier to float over the course of the year.
Okay.
It is a float, it's not a loss.
Well, why don't we do this? Let's go ahead, let's split the difference even further here, Mr. Englander. We'll first instruct the city attorney to prepare and present an ordinance to extend the date after which a fine may be applied to a late filer who owes no gross receipts tax to April 15th. We'll further instruct the city attorney to prepare and present an ordinance, same for those who owe taxes, to March 15th. And then, in addition to having the city attorney begin working on those ordinances, why don't we ask the CAO to, you know what? Yeah, we'll ask the CAO to take the lead on reaching out to not just the Greater LA Chamber, but the local chambers as well, to provide input on this change so that we can consider it prior to voting on the ordinances for next year. And then they can report, we can bring them in here, or you can summarize their input. I'm fine either way with that.
So this will go to council with that instruction?
Yeah. Does that make sense? So we,
Want to send it to council?
Ask for the ordinance.
to work on the ordinances that,
Right.
yeah.
We can't instruct.
And simultaneously ask for these report back, and then when, we obviously have to see them before we go to the final work.
Yeah. And, the ordinances wouldn't kick in until next year anyway, so we have time to consider whether or not we're on the right track. But the city attorney can get to work in the meantime. Does that seem reasonable? Sure. Okay. There's no objection then? Yes.
Mr. Chair, and what would be the action on the Office of Finance's reports? Would it still be to note and file those?
Yes. Thank you. Okay, so without objection, that will be the action on item number 5. And then, members, before you run off, I'd like to reconsider items 6 and 7. Item 7 had a technical, item 6 had a technical correction, which I'm sorry, Mr. Williams, could you please reread it?
Sure.
Now that we have all members.
The technical correction for item number 6, which is motion rule relative to the transfer of funding for continued geographic information system software maintenance and support from vendor Esri Inc. for fiscal year 2017-18 was for the entire amount of $171,777 for the Department of Sanitation, should come from Fund 100, Department 82, account 003040 for fiscal year 2017-18.
All right, and with that technical correction then, we had proposed for consent approval items 6 and 7 as amended. Any objection? Seeing none, those items are unanimously approved as amended on item 6. All right, and with that, if there's no other business before the committee, we are adjourned.